for businesses so that they may not only survive, but they may come out of it and thrive. What we said quite repetitively in the last recording when we were dealing with individuals, we said that certainly the pandemic that we're going through right now is not a sprint, but rather a marathon. We have seen from the research that we have done and the solutions that we've tabled that indeed it is not a shotgun approach. It's not something that's going to take 6 months to turn around, but we see it mostly being interfaced and intertwined for the next 18 to 24 months. What I'd like to do now is get into the 6 aspects of what are we actually meant to consider and put in place as we stabilize our businesses and gear them back for success. The first phase, which is critically important, and I will explain why, is called the pre-crisis record analysis phase. So it's a pre-crisis. And what are some of the information that we've been looking at there is your financial data on your performance over the last 3 years. Why not just the last year? Why can't we just look at the latest budgets? Why can't we just look at the budget actuals to kind of see where we have gone into? Because we need to clarify why, the why effect. Why is the business where it is right now? So if you look at the trend analysis over the last 3 years, you can see a few things. First being, the business was headed downward. If you look at the key ratios that we're looking at, or it was pretty healthy and then received business interruption, or it was quite unsystematically, performing. So if you look at the last 3 years, you can be able to tell a pattern on the performance. We usually do that via key ratio analysis, including working capital. So once you table that in front of you and you put it on the graph, you can be able to see, okay, is there systematic performance and what is the pattern being? Are we in trouble now simply because the business model itself was under severe pressure and then COVID just really strained it? Or we were doing exceptionally well, but due to hard lockdowns and impracticalities of trade, such as maybe the tourism sector or the hospitality, etc., that has gone by. Therefore, that is the first critical stage, and this you can do quite easily, with the assistance of your accountant, or you can even reach into your auditors, your external auditors, to be able to help you with that advice. So once you have that picture, you have a trend, then you can kind of anticipate, then you are ready for step 2. What is step 2? This is now the impact assessment. And there's some critical lines that we need to tackle when we're doing an impact assessment. There's a combination what lies in your financial statements in terms of your comprehensive income or your financial position, which is your balance sheet. And one of the things that are really becoming granular when you look at these is look at the why, is to understand the why. First and foremost, if you have more than one income streams, you need to separate those. Separate the income streams that you have and then look at the robustness or the resiliency of each and the relevancy of each going forward, because that will be able to give us a good indication as to how it should be performing going forward. And you match that, where you have a revenue line or a sales line, match it with the corresponding cost of sales. Look at the performance of those. Some of those might be performing very well, some of those might have become irrelevant, and some of them might be severely pressured. In all of the analysis that we're doing, it is wise and recommended that you break it down into 3 phases. The very first phase being the acute phase. This is usually the phase of a lockdown. This is anything between 3 or 4 months that is there. That's the acute phase. Then you have the suppression phase. The suppression phase is probably something from 6 to 12 months. This is where things starts to happen, business starts to come by, and economic injection takes place. And then you have the recovery phase. The recovery phase is something that will last, typically between 12 and 24 months. So those are the 3 phases. Whenever you're analyzing impacts of any line item, look at the performance in those stages. What do I mean in a nutshell? We are strongly recommending that we do, illustrative modeling, where we actually are, to as far a degree that we can, do a predictive analysis as to what exactly we're dealing with in those 3 phases of each line. So typical things that you will have a look at pertain to COVID impact, pertaining to the COVID impact assessment. You will look at your sales. You look at why it has been impacted negatively or positively. Is it because of the restrictions of a hard lockdown that there was no delivery, or there was mandatorily restricted trade for yourself, or you couldn't get your supply in and therefore you couldn't make your product, and therefore you couldn't sell? It's very encouraged to see and drill down as to the why of each line item. Once we have done that, and this is recommended strongly for purposes of your sales, your cost of sales, as well as how the performance of your gross margin is, working capital, that speaks to your cash flow aspect, as well as the strength of your balance sheet when it comes to reserves, when it comes to the liabilities needs to be financed, as well as inventory levels. So in as far as that is concerned, once you have done that, now you have a backward glance picture as well as an impact of COVID-19 picture, and we are then ready to move to how do we crisis management, strategize, and provide an action plenary. The third phase of our 6-step approach that we're going to be looking at now is by far what I consider to be the most important, and this deals with what are the overarching strategic themes that need to be considered in the way forward as you navigate your business. What do I mean by that? What is top of mind in terms of a negotiable, a slightly negotiable, or a completely negotiable aspect of actually running your business? And I'll give you a couple of examples in a few minutes. So some of the strategic themes that we can look at talk to items such as when you're looking at your sales decline strategy, or cost reduction is one of your imperatives, or you actually want to bolster your working capital management aspects, or you really want to position the business to be able to tap into any kind of grants that are out there and relief systems that are out there to kind of make it in the short term. And what I quite enjoy about this section of the strategy of your business as you manage the crises is to delve deeper and to answer the questions as what is the most important thing for whoever's developing the strategy to know as a non-negotiable. So let me give you a couple of examples of what we're talking about now. Number one, if ownership dilution is a non-negotiable, that needs to be established up front. Otherwise, all other solutions that lead to a possible dilution of ownership can really be taken out of the equation. If then another example is the maintaining your relationships with the positive impacts on your key stakeholders, if that's really critical, then that plan that we're trying to come up with now needs to delve into those aspects to kind of answer the question, who are those critical stakeholders? How do they affect how you run your business? And what are the things that needs to be considered in how you communicate with them? And what kind of negotiations we need to get into? A third example could be seeking external finance or facilities on a commercial basis. And if that is an avenue to be explored as to how do we refinance the business as we get it out of an acute phase into suppression and recovery phase, and as well as, you know, the preservation of a competitive advantage, if that's critical. If you, the type of business needs to stay on the forefront of the game, that always needs to sharpen your niche and your unique value proposition. Therefore, you're not only looking at survival modes, but you're actually looking for best practice and some leadership. The last one that we've seen and we've heard of a lot in the last few weeks and months speaks to the, you know, tapping into government grants, etc. This becomes a bittersweet aspect when we consider really the micro and smaller businesses, because many of them could not even take any advantage of, you know, some of the relief schemes that have been there, as well as some of the the COVID tears that they could have, you know, tapped into, simply because on a compliance basis they were just not compliant. Now, this is where the game needs to start for those smaller businesses, to make sure that on a compliance level, at least you've got a valid tax certificate in, you don't owe SARS unnecessarily, you don't have judgments against you, therefore you have your license to operate, so to speak. So once you have those things in place, it's then easier to get into the conversations. But when you're not even in the room, there's really nothing that we can point to that can kind of give us relief. And then lastly, what we need to look at is appetite for collaborations. Because I think that it is quite certain that the future is certainly collaborative, and how we actually navigate out of the space will to some degree or other, you know, be impacted by our natural competition. What can we actually put our heads to, or whether or not that's an option altogether, are things that we need to prioritize, so that by doing those things we can be able to quite succinctly define our cost base and stratify it between what is fixed, what is an overhead, what's a moving kind of fluid target, and how that correlates to your top line. It's quite imperative to bolster down. Why are those things important? It's because when we get to the solution space and we're looking at what is really going to be a breakthrough objective that moves your business from really being on life support to actually recovering quite nicely, is going to depend on those aspects quite fundamentally. So that's the third phase. And what I'd like to do now is to talk through some of the principles that speaks to now the action planary phase. That's the fourth phase, fourth of the sixth. Action planary, this is where now you are making solutions. And this speaks to, you know, projections. These projections are more than just forward-looking budgets or forecasts that you have done before, but you actually built into this assumptions some of the key, you know, factors that you have seen been unpacked from your pre-pandemic stage, which we have explained at step 1, as well as taking what is important to the shareholders and directors in navigating the way forward. This will then allow us to actually build a scenario plan that can look into the next 2 to 3 years to say, predictively, this is what we anticipate. If we introduce, some income from a commercial basis, this is going to have to affect, impact on the scenario placing this way. If there's a grant, if the mixture of the two, how's that going to pan out? And we'll also do an assessment of how are your clients behaving, what's important to them, what is the information that is available saying about the specific industry in which your business operates in, and how it can actually expect to perform in future. Those are the things that we'll take into account. And do you have a capital to reinvest into the business? And would you be able to tap into that without diluting your shareholding if it's not an option? And those are things that we take into account. So now we have to come to a intersection of really looking at it from a broader perspective and saying, from an income statement perspective, this is the behavior I'm anticipating to see, and this is how it can actually carry itself forward. So once we have analyzed those things and we've kind of bolstered it down and says, okay, we think now we are in a position where we have sufficient information to be able to kind of model how we can reforecast and relook at what the financial pattern should be looking like for my business specifically to thrive. So we are now going to look at the fifth phase, and that's really talking about that forecasting element and that financial planning element, and ultimately and conclusively in the sixth element, we will look at how the monitoring and evaluation actually interfaces, because it's quite critical that aspect is always present for the transitional phase to take place to see us into prosperity. Now that we have gone through the first 4 phases of our action plenary as to what do you actually need to consider in gearing your business for this phase and for it to thrive in the near future, we're now getting into the 5th phase of the 6 that we have spoken about, and that speaks to the revised forecasting and the financial plan. Now, without a plan, you're sure to fail. So this is where we bolster down and do the heavy lifting and really interrogate the numbers to prepare, kind of anticipate what is to come, so that we can continue to benchmark from there as to how our performance actually is. So in the revised forecasting stage, what is it that you're going to need? You're going to need what you prepared for in phase 1, and that's your pre-crisis pack that speaks into the last 3 years prior to us being hit by the pandemic. You're also going to need what the assessment timeline and the impact assessment, which line items have been severely impacted in your financial statements, and what are some of the overarching priorities that you have as a business, non-negotiables, and items that can be negotiated in trying to formulate where are we not supposed to go in formulating a solution forward. So therefore, when we're speaking about the revised forecasting plan, all of that critical information has got to be taken in, and it's got to be loaded up as an assumption into the modeling going forward. This is a good place to, if you haven't, to bring in your accountant on board and for them to understand holistically how and where we are positioning the business for success. This is also going to mean that what we build into is not a hard and fast based on a rule, and it's not necessarily 100% gospel truth. There's an assumption to it. There's an assumption to it, but it's an educated estimate at the end of the day. What we're then going to do is that we are going to understand the behavioral patterns of our financial performance based on what we do know and what we can anticipate that we can build into these. Also, when we do these kinds of projections forwards, it's important for us to kind of look to the left and the right and to understand what the macroeconomic situation is, as well as so that from there we can kind of funnel into our own corporate risk assessment and see how we could be impacted by such things. Some of the things that are happening, you can interpret them to be happening at a higher level, far detached from how you run your business. You'll remember though that not so long ago we were battling severe droughts in the country, in many aspects of the country, and if you had never accounted for climate change risk, it could have been, or it was a rude awakening to come alive and say, okay, what's my BCP, business continuity plan now, to take into account the climate change risk? How is climate change risk going to interface into how I do what I do? How is it going to impact on that? How is it going to impact on the prices that I deliver on in terms of my end services or goods to the customer? So big picture thinking, you're kind of putting in your thinking hat on, and what you do want to do is to have an overarching view, a 360 angle. It's almost not possible to kind of arrive at that on your own, and this is where I really strongly recommend that you have an independent eye, casting eye, asking some different questions perhaps, and probing you into what maybe you wouldn't have seen because you've looked at it for too many times. But what is critically important is that whatever it looks like at the end of the day, you need to be able to understand it, you need to be able to interpret it, and because if you can't do that, there's no way that you can be able to be prepared to transition into the last phase, which speaks to the monitoring and the evaluation aspect of what you have actually prepared. Because truth be told, what we are preparing for is something that we can say, as things have shifted, this is where we find ourselves, and this is projecting where we are supposed to go. It's going to really impact on your decision making. It's going to also impact on your finances. Therefore, this is why we do what we do. Phase number 6, which is the last phase, speaks to the execution, actually getting down and doing what the plans say you needed to do, and also building on accountability. I think that by far is, it's the most crucial aspect. Everything that you have done up until now can totally go to waste without the element of accountability being built in. Accountability is not only built or bolstered, it's at the top, it also needs to be interfaced throughout the business so that we can shift culture. Because it's very easy for us to come to do all these lovely plans and then let them collect dust because we can't really transition. So when we make sure that somebody who's going to be asking the critical questions, interpreting the information, benchmarking it to the plans, and holding us accountable, then we do have something that we can work with. The strength of everything that we have done up until now filters into executing as well as the monitoring. Just that mirror, that can keep you accountable for what we have worked through up until now. But in the whole monitoring and evaluation and execution phase, it's important to be agile. And when we are agile, we're actually taking into account things that we may not have predicted, that are quite extraordinary or big enough, significant, that we'll then need to take into account and say, okay, now that we can see that this was not on the radar, how does this then shift the whole model going forward? What we're trying to do is to come up with as realistic as possible of a scenario plan, backed by experience, backed by numbers, and backed by accountability, to kind of make sure that as we take this route on course, that is not a sprint but a marathon, but we actually have enduring power. Now, sustainability speaks to something that's more than just surviving, but it speaks to the resilience of the business to be able to absorb shocks, which could be interpreted as turbulent times or pandemics of this nature, so that they can actually continue to speak to stewardship and prosperity long after we have come out of COVID-19. So my hope in breaking all of this down quite to size in every level, not too much detail as well, is to be able to kind of start thinking in the right direction as to what things are really pertinent to put in place to make sure that there's prosperity and success and succession of the business which I lead. So in a nutshell, I would like to conclude by saying that, you know, if you have no plan at all, it's easy to fail. But the strength of any business lies in strategy, execution, monitoring, and evaluation to kind of know that you can get there. It's not going to take luck to survive as businesses out of the pandemic. It's not going to take wishes. It's also not going to take burying our heads in the sand and kind of like hoping and waiting for things to blow over. It's actually going to take decisive action and leadership to transition to here. So therefore, you know, as we have said when we started our engagement, that really what we are after is seeking wisdom from God to direct, influence, and really position us for what is to come. In summary, what we have dealt with is a pre-COVID-19 impact on your business. That was phase one. The second phase being first it was the pre-COVID-19 that we have been dealing with as a business. That is, you know, what we spoke about in the first phase. And then we kind of very quickly went to phase two, which was speaking about the impact assessment now, looking at the different items in your financial statements and scrutinizing the why of the behavior. We then went on to look at the high-level strategies and wishes, where we can incorporate that non-financial or non-functional expectations and wishes, so that we can make sure when we come up with action plenary, we've taken everything that is necessary into account. Phase four saw us getting into the crisis and action plenary. Phase five is where we then had enough information to prepare us to have a revised forecast, a financial plan, as well as landing on section 6, where we have execution power and monitoring and evaluation. I sure hope that we can, through what we have already gone through, but muster up the courage to take it forward. Thank you.